Thanks everyone who's online for listening this month to our IPM speaker series. We are great this month to have one of our internal people, Matthias Kleinz, who's kindly accepted the invitation to speak this month. So Matthias, for those that don't know, is Executive Vice President of the Translational Sciences team at UPMC Enterprises. Matthias joined UPMC Enterprises in July 2017 to help the investment and commercialization innovative translational sciences strategy. He sits on the board of UPMC Enterprises portfolio companies Novasenta, Generian, and Cerevance, and he's also a member of the executive committee of the UPMC Genome Center. Matthias graduated from Justus Liebig University in Gießen. That's bad, I should know my German, yeah. With a doctorate in...
You of all people should, yes.
With a doctorate in clinical veterinary medicine. Prior to UPMC Enterprises, he spent 9 years in management consulting at L.E.K Consulting in its life science practice in Boston and London, heading teams on over 70 strategic assignments for clients in the US, Europe, and Japan. Matthias completed his PhD in Clinical Pharmacology Unit at the University of Cambridge in the UK, working on early stage discovery of G protein coupled receptor targets for hypertension, heart disease, and metabolic syndrome. In his presentation, which is entitled Realizing the Promise of Precision Medicine, Perspectives from the Nexus of Clinical Care and Investment, Matthias will talk on precision medicine opportunities and challenges, including investor perspectives. Thank you, Matthias. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Adrian. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for giving us an opportunity to share some of our perspectives, which I think reflect both perspectives of UPMC more broadly, as well as specific perspectives of UPMC Enterprises as the investment and technology incubation arm of UPMC today. But before I kind of launch into the presentation, we'd have structured in a way where we'll talk briefly about who Enterprises is and what we do, because not everyone on the call or not everyone on the conference might know all of that, and then getting into precision medicine and specifically the investor perspectives. Because before I do that, I think one thing that I wanted to say up front is I feel, you're forcing me to preach to the choir here. I think I'm probably talking to an audience that very well understands what precision medicine is, what the promise and the potential of precision medicine is, and, probably also has a certain degree of awareness of, where some of the challenges still lie. But having said that, I hope to bring some unique perspectives to the table today, because I think while we all know, and I think we've seen increasingly that precision medicine real, I think it's far from easy. And I think there's a number of things that come into play there. I think we've seen tremendous, evolution of the fundamental technology supporting precision medicine type of approaches, both on the diagnostic and on the therapeutic side of things in recent years. Next generation sequencing, high throughput proteomics, that's very promising technology that will ultimately get us there. I think the scientific evidence is also getting bigger and bigger. I think we start to understand better, like how personalized molecular drivers underpin disease. And I think that holds tremendous, promise. But I think ultimately, we also still see some significant challenges from a perspective of the clinical implementation of this type of technology, because I think as scale and data requirements increase, I think that on a day-to-day basis becomes more and more challenging. I think we have to bring the clinical community up from a perspective of their level of literacy and education to really make sense of all this new information that we can provide them through precision medicine. And I think last not but least, I think from an investment perspective, precision medicine receives a lot of attention, but I think there are also some unique challenges that I want to dive a little bit deeper on today and make people understand where, as an investor, we are really excited about precision medicine and where we see some of the more challenging areas of the space that we, as UPMC, as a healthcare system, try to help companies in those spaces navigate. So I think with that in mind, I'll get into a brief introduction to UPMC Enterprises, and then we'll basically get into the meat of things here. So to provide a short overview about UPMC Enterprises, we're essentially one of the 4 divisions of one of the largest fully integrated healthcare delivery and insurance systems in the country. UPMC really has always prided itself of not just delivering care, but on innovating the way that we ultimately advance healthcare and advance science and medicine. And I think UPMC Enterprises is an important part of this. We do that in close collaboration with our academic partners at the University of Pittsburgh. I think the ongoing partnership we have with Adrian and the Institute of Precision Medicine is, I think, a good reflection of that. And we do it more broadly, ultimately by supporting innovative, cutting-edge science at the University of Pittsburgh on an ongoing basis. I think over the last 5 years, since the inception of the Translational Sciences team at UPMC Enterprises that I'm a part of here, we've done that, to the degree of about 120 million or so project support that we've provided, and we continue to do that because I think that is the innovation that ultimately changes care for our patients. And as a nice aside, has helped us, for example, create companies like Novasenta and Generian that Adrian referenced earlier that we're involved in and that we're using to basically take ideas from the University of Pittsburgh, push them into the marketplace, and ultimately create products that deliver life-changing medicine. I think, as I indicated, UPMC Enterprises is one of the 4 divisions of UPMC, alongside the Provider Services Division, the International Division, and the Insurance Services Division. I think one of the key strengths of our models here is that, all these divisions at UPMC don't exist in isolation or at silos, but that they ultimately are closely connected in the way that we think about delivering healthcare and innovating in healthcare. And, as we get into the conversation on precision medicine today, I think it'll become very much apparent that some of that connectivity, especially with the Provider Services and the Insurance Services Division, is going to be very critical. And I think that's where Enterprises tries to be a catalyst for conversations and a catalyst for compromises that ultimately are going to be required to realize the value that precision medicine can provide in healthcare in the future. UPMC Enterprises specifically, as I said, is the incubation and healthcare innovation arm of UPMC. Ultimately, our mission is to drive transformative ideas into thriving businesses and life-changing medicine. So we really take early stage academic and scientific ideas. We help investigators form commercially focused development plans for their ideas and technologies, provide financial support, I think in some instances where we can, intellectual support, and then also technical support along the way, oftentimes with a goal in mind to form companies that ultimately then really scale these technologies and bring them to the marketplace in our patients. We do that really through the systematic integration of clinical, technical, and financial expertise that exists on our team here at UPMC Enterprises, and in close collaboration with our academic and our business partners at UPMC and the University of Pittsburgh. And we do that across 2 focus areas. I'm part of the Translational Sciences team, which you could most easily probably describe as all investments and incubation efforts that UPMC Enterprises drives in the life sciences discipline. So that's biopharmaceuticals, medical devices, diagnostics, and life science tools. But we also do, and I think that's in some ways actually where UPMC Enterprises originated, have a digital solutions team. So a team that's headed up by my colleague, Brent Burns, that really is using data and software-driven solutions to solve big problems in the delivery of healthcare, in the engagement of patients, and in the operation of healthcare service facilities and operations. From a translational sciences perspective, when it comes to the opportunity for us to invest, we have a lot of opportunity to do so. We have a $1 billion evergreen commitment from UPMC to make investments, both early stage as well as mid and late stage, in life sciences companies and life sciences ideas with our academic partners. And we do that through primarily investment in 4 disease areas that we emphasize, which is in oncology, immunology and autoimmune disease, ophthalmology, and central nervous system disorders. But we try to be pragmatic about it. So this is not a black and white picture where we say, if you approach us with an idea that sits out of those 4 areas, we won't look at an investment. Instead, we basically cross-reference that disease area focus with what we consider transformational approaches in life sciences. And I think this is where you see precision health or precision medicine as one of the key themes that we look at across the board, together with cell therapies, transformational platforms, and gene therapy type of approaches. I think the reason that precision medicine is at the top of the list here is because we think one of the reasons, and we'll talk about that later in the presentation a little bit more, that oncology is so attractive for investors is because oncology has been at the forefront of the implementation of precision medicine and precision health. I think that's fundamentally, changed the risk profile of investments in oncology, because there's a better way to pair patients with those therapies that either in the clinical setting, but also earlier in clinical development, are likely to respond to those therapies. And I think it fundamentally changes the economics and I think the risk benefit profile for a possible investor. And I think we're starting to see that promise emerge in other areas as well. I think ultimately the great thing would be is if we start to see a lot more precision medicine approaches in other complex and severe diseases like cardiovascular disease, like respiratory disease, and so on and so forth. And I think as we start to see those precision medicine approaches emerge in those areas, I think we'll also get more excited about those areas from an investment perspective, because I think we feel we're increasing the likelihood of success when we make an investment in those areas by applying precision medicine type of approaches. I think another thing to briefly mention to people that have not interacted or have not heard much about UPMC Enterprises yet, the investments we make, basically we typically make through two different paths. I've talked a lot about company formation already. I think this is something that we do from the earliest stages of innovation by collaborating with investigators at the University of Pittsburgh around very promising scientific ideas that address major medical unmet needs. Probably some of you have heard about those efforts in the last year in particular, because that was the first time that we ran a systematic request for proposals in certain disease areas with basically all academic staff within the School of Pharmacy and the medical school at Pitt. And I think that's what we use really as the feeder mechanism to drive identification of new promising ideas. But we don't only do that, we also do syndicated investing in established companies. And those companies can be here in Pittsburgh, they can be anywhere else in the United States, or they can even be in other places across the globe. I think we try to do really one thing with this combined approach. We try to build a diversified portfolio that gives UPMC access to all the innovative technologies out there, because ultimately we are trying to make a difference for our patients. And that's where in the end it doesn't matter whether the innovation hails here in Pittsburgh or whether it hails in Paris, or whether it hails from Seoul or somewhere in China. We are open to engaging innovators that can ultimately make a difference to our patients, that can improve their quality of life or can address their medical unmet needs. And I think where those opportunities are emerging, we are open for business. We're willing to invest. This is a final quick overview of our existing portfolio for translational sciences specifically. You can see on here we've had a couple of recent successes and exits of companies like Abound Bio and L.E.K, but we also still manage a pretty sizable portfolio that's growing. We've in the recent past typically added about 3 to 5 new investments in new companies to the portfolio every year. Precision medicine does feature in here quite a bit. It always depends a little bit on what flavor of precision medicine you're talking about here, but Blue Sphere Bio, for example, a company that we've invested in the T-cell receptor space, is really going after highly personalized oncology treatments for solid tumors. So I think that's probably one of our flagship precision medicine investments. Other companies on this list basically take similar types of approaches. And I think the other big investment, and we'll talk about that again a little bit at a later stage, that we've made in precision medicine is the support that we've provided in establishing the UPMC Genome Center, which is a fully CAP/CLIA certified high throughput gene sequencing center that can deliver both research as well as clinical sequencing here out of UPMC for the academic and the clinical community in the region. I think that's been, a big driver for some really interesting and innovative projects that ultimately drive towards the implementation of precision medicine, in the region and more broadly. So Adrian, I'm just going to, throw it out there to you. This is basically the transition point where I'm going to start to talk more broadly about precision medicine. If there are specific questions about UPMC Enterprises, I don't know whether we want to address them right now or whether we should move on in the presentation.
I thought that was a great intro. There are no questions in the chat at the moment, so I think it would be fine, Matthias, unless someone puts something in the chat right now, I think it would be fine to move on to the next stage.
Perfect. So let's do that.
Yeah.
So talking about precision medicine a little bit, and it goes back to the point that I can hardly claim that I'm an expert, but I try to really cover the broad brush, I think, themes that we as a healthcare system see in terms of the value precision medicine can provide, and transitioning also into, how we as healthcare investors think about, the different ways that we can support precision medicine approaches depending on their degree of maturity and their possible applications in healthcare. So I think you're probably all aware of the fact that precision medicine is really aimed towards one specific goal, which is pairing the right patient with the right therapy at the right time. I think, at least as I read and as I've learned about the concept of precision medicine, I think that's, in my mind, what it boils down to. And it relies ultimately on creating what I would call a virtual cycle of information that basically bridges between, the fundamental information about the patient in question and some more advanced data points around the patient's condition and some potential molecular biomarkers that underpin those conditions to drive ultimately the clinical care of the patient, which could sometimes be, simply making a decision between aggressively or less aggressively intervening, but it could basically go all the way to specifically selecting particular therapeutic options for a patient, ultimately with a goal of ensuring and maximizing the likelihood of success of that therapy and ultimately driving better outcomes for the patient. So I think that's probably no surprise to anyone. When we look at that in its clinical implementation, I think I alluded to this earlier, the real value that precision oncology has provided so far, and I think that's reflected a little bit in this survey feedback that the Center for Connected Medicine at UPMC has gathered in 2019, is being realized and also is being seen by individuals in the clinical community in the oncology space. And I think the other big area where we're starting to see real value emerging from precision medicine is pharmacogenomics. But I think beyond that, the currently accepted use cases and the value creation, I think, is a lot more sparse. And I think that's where that opportunity for growth that I alluded to earlier exists. But I think we ultimately have to ask ourselves the question, how do we basically get to that ideal stage where precision medicine provides improved patient care and potentially also reduced cost of healthcare in a broader set of patients? It's going to be a process. And I think one of the things that will be really important in that process is the generation of evidence, because I think ultimately, while the clinical community and also the payer community is very excited about the promise of precision medicine, in many, many instances, I think all those stakeholder groups still see significant gaps in the clear, well-validated evidence for clinical effectiveness. And I think that's where we as UPMC try to be proactive and try to be good partners to players in the industry that try to generate that evidence. But it's not trivial, because I think it ultimately, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment, requires you to align incentives that are not naturally aligned in healthcare these days, and also to sometimes remove, I think, data silos that have been created over time that I think need to be broken up and unlocked as we try to really realize the benefit of precision medicine. So when I talk about those data silos, what I'm talking about really is the fact that if you want to demonstrate that a biomarker, for example, has clinical relevance in changing the therapeutic paradigm for a particular disease or for a particular patient, you might have your hypothesis, but to prove that in a way that physicians have confidence in that biomarkers and that payers will be willing to pay for that, if it basically is converted into a product, it requires data sharing in many different ways between those two stakeholder groups, but also between individuals that ultimately are the source of that data and the discovery community. And I think that's not an easy task, because I think we know there are ethical constraints to data sharing. There are value exchange concerns when it comes to data sharing. And there's probably also just purely logistical challenges associated with data sharing when you think about interoperability of healthcare data, which is not completely optimized, and data systems that have been established in healthcare have not been designed to support discovery research, but have typically focused primarily on streamlining clinical workflows. But I think it's not all lost, and I think ultimately it falls on organizations like ours who are large enough, who have scale and see enough patients to really think about how we, in the day-to-day course of care and in the research that we support, can probably help to break up these data silos and ultimately drive innovations in healthcare and in precision medicine in particular. This is a slide that just basically highlights one of the challenges here when it comes to data sharing by individuals to support research. We're basically seeing some different data points here for different types of healthcare data that, may or may not be shared by individuals based on their own perceived risk. And you see that, yes, patients are willing to share healthcare data, but it's typically the relatively one-dimensional and trivial data points like, the results of a full blood exam that patients are willing to share. And that they basically also have access to from a sharing perspective when it comes to the more valuable and more promising data sets like genomic sequencing data, proteomic data, or multi-omic data. At the bottom of the page here, you can see that both, I think, the availability of those data sets, but also the willingness of individuals to share those data with researchers or with product development companies is much reduced. And I think that's where we need to take ourselves to task as a scientific community to ensure that we support and establish data sharing frameworks that are responsible, protect data privacy and protect the interests of the patient, and ultimately try to find strike the right balance between offering that value to the community and at the same time recognizing that it's ultimately data that comes from an individual that has personal rights and has concerns about potentially misuse of that data. I think as an interesting aside, Adrian and I are currently both working on a committee for the University of Pittsburgh to kind of re-establish or fully establish a data and sample sharing policy for research purposes. And I think it's a good indication, again, of people across the system recognizing the importance of data sharing to drive innovation, and making sure that we have all the right tools in place to do it more responsibly with potentially greater impact in the future. So despite the challenges that I've highlighted here, ultimately, I think there's a lot of promise in precision medicine. And we're basically starting to see some of that, having a real impact, because we see some degree of use of precision medicine in areas outside of oncology, which has been the leading edge. So in areas like autoimmune disease, infectious disease, and rare genetic disorders, precision medicine practices are becoming more and more common. We're basically seeing an expansion of the potential modalities that can be used to drive precision medicine biomarkers. And I think, for example, the scaling of proteomic technology as a second wave of innovation beyond genomics, I think is a great case in point here. And I think we're also seeing increasing investment by the industry more broadly, most notably biopharma, which ultimately has the deepest pockets to invest in innovation to support precision medicine type of approaches. I think you see on the right-hand side here a few statistics around, how prevalent precision medicine type of approaches, most notably companion diagnostic approaches, are in the pipeline and in the recent approvals by the FDA. And you basically really start to see, I think, that we're seeing a groundswell of support for precision medicine approaches that will ultimately move this field forward in the future. I think these are basically just some supporting data points where, from a perspective of investing in the infrastructure and being excited about the potential of precision medicine, I think many healthcare systems are starting to make the appropriate investments, but I think it's not necessarily uniform across the space. And I think depending on the applications, I think the level of implementation differs. To the point that I raised earlier, I think you're starting to see precision medicine approaches emerge in different places. But I think oncology still is basically at the forefront of precision medicine innovation. I think you see a couple of examples of biomarkers that drive treatment decisions in oncology listed here on the right. And I think what we've seen over time here is that whilst I think initially you often had to think about companion diagnostic as a single, biomarker, be that proteomic or be it genomic. I think that, is emerging. And I think we're starting to be able to support more and more complex treatment decisions as we've seen multi-omic markers and as we've seen multiplexed markers emerging in oncology. For example, when you now look at treatment decisions in immuno-oncology, Keytruda is listed here as a specific treatment option as an immunotherapy agent for oncology. The PD-L1 immunohistochemistry biomarker, which is basically in the category of traditional companion diagnostics by now, is typically considered, I think, an insufficient and somewhat limited biomarker when it comes to therapy response, but it now is basically being combined with other complex biomarkers such as tumor mutational burden and microsatellite instability to ultimately drive more sophisticated and ultimately more reliable treatment decisions in patients that potentially would benefit from immunotherapy. And I think I alluded to this already earlier. The FDA is ultimately behind this because you really see that, we've seen a consistent theme in terms of, early in the 2000s, precision medicine didn't play that big a role. There were years where no dedicated companion diagnostic driven approvals, were part of the yearly approval of drugs. But I think that share has basically expanded. And most importantly, you now pretty much consistently see that new therapies, especially in oncology, typically have a precision medicine or, a precision oncology and companion diagnostic approach. Going back to, I think, one of the earlier premises that we talked about and moving beyond purely the implementation of precision medicine, I think one of the great promises of precision medicine is, that dichotomy of improving health outcomes while reducing the cost of care. We're seeing, I think, more and more examples of that emerging, both, more globally within the industry as well as here in Pittsburgh. I think on this side, we're highlighting, I think, both the evidence that's emerging in various therapeutic areas to really demonstrate that precision medicine therapy is more effective than, standard therapies that don't rely on personalized markers. So on the left-hand side, you basically see some response rates in oncology when you compare genetically driven targeted therapy with chemotherapy, for example. But we're also basically seeing, and that's shown on the right-hand side, increasing strong evidence for the fact that we're not just improving patient outcomes, but we can do it in a way that also bends the cost curve in healthcare. And, pharmacogenomics, I think one of the disciplines that I referenced earlier, I think is one that really starts to stand out here as the cutting edge of precision medicine that demonstrates not just patient benefit, but also health economic benefit to the system. And I think there in particular, I think with the work that we've seen here in Pittsburgh emerge from folks like Phil Empey, I think we're really supporting some groundbreaking innovation, and we're at the early leading edge of adoption of some of these transformational technologies to basically guide the way that we provide care for our patients and do it in the most cost-effective way. So despite all these positive things that I highlighted here, the reality on a day-to-day basis is that precision medicine implementation still remains probably slower than we would all like to see it. You see a piece of survey feedback again here from the Center for Connected Medicine at UPMC that highlights that there's still a significant share of healthcare systems that are not really deploying precision medicine in a significant or systematic fashion. And there's also a still pretty large share that describes their level of adoption or their level of investment in the area as low, while only probably about a third of healthcare systems really are starting to accelerate their investment in the space. And, I think at that point, I started to ask myself the question, well, why is that? And, it basically really requires you to unpack what some of the underlying challenges probably could be, because we know the promise is great, but ultimately, as I stated earlier, the devil is in the detail. So I think the big thing goes back in my mind to basically creating aligned incentives and sharing data. It's pretty clear that ultimately, when you try to square the circle between public and private payers, providers, and ultimately a large plethora of healthcare technology companies that innovate in this space, be that pharmaceutical companies, be it diagnostic companies, be it life science tool companies, or to some degree medical device companies, even though those tend to take less of a precision medicine approach these days. It basically is not trivial to kind of get them all on the same page. And I think that's where we as UPMC see ourselves in a unique position, because we, in some ways, as an organization, already represent a number of these stakeholder groups that need to be aligned. And when you do that in one organization, it certainly becomes easier than doing this on a one-off basis by trying to approach, let's call it, a complete stranger. But not only that, I think we also really, buy into the idea of precision in medicine. And as a result of that, have been proactively reaching out to other stakeholders and other players in the industry to kind of get ahead of the curve and really co-invest and collaborate with others in the industry to generate, I think, the data that will be so important to support increasing adoption of precision medicine approaches and continued innovation in this space. So when you think a little bit more specifically about the barriers that I think you see across stakeholder groups, the one thing that stands out to me is that while everyone along this spectrum, starting with pharma partners and provider systems and the patient, has something to gain from precision medicine, each and every one of them also has their specific deterrents, I would say. You look, for example, at pharma. Pharma, on the one hand, really likes to leverage precision medicine, as I said earlier, to maximize the promise of their therapeutics and maximize the likelihood of success, both in the clinical and the clinical trial setting. But at the same time, there are basically disincentives where, in some ways, every biomarker that a pharmaceutical company applies to basically categorize or to stratify a patient population can potentially result in a more limited commercial opportunity for that pharmaceutical. So you can see how that's a difficult decision-making process for a pharmaceutical company that has to decide, do I decide to include or exclude a companion diagnostic or a more complex precision medicine approach in my drug development plan? And unless there's basically distinct guidance or pressure from other stakeholders in the system, the outcome might sometimes not be in the best interest of the provider or the payer or the patient. And I think some of these similar dichotomies exist across all of the other stakeholder groups highlighted here, where in the end, I think it can only be dialogue between these various stakeholder groups that can ultimately drive us to basically get on the same page, recognize each other's both potential benefits, but also the potential barriers that might hold back our adoption. And I think, we're really trying to create that type of dialogue as we, as investors in particular, navigate between working with pharmaceutical companies, some of which we're involved in more closely as we represent a provider system and as we ultimately try to, create real benefits for our patients. So I think we talked about a lot of this already. We ultimately, as a result of that, at UPMC, invest heavily in advancing science, building evidence, and creating aligned incentives, because I think that ultimately has the potential to remove some of these unaligned incentives and basically create the data sets that will further, realize the value of precision medicine. And to talk more specifically about, I think, some of the things that we've done here is, the active investments that we've made through the ITTC and through the PhD, the Pittsburgh Health Data Alliance in recent years, discovering new biomarkers, for example, falls into that category and to the scientific side of things. We work, for example, with Adrian to ultimately support precision medicine more broadly. We support, through the University of Pittsburgh and through UPMC, one of the largest recruiting sites for the All of Us initiative that's supported by the US government to ultimately generate data sets that drive precision medicine innovation. And I think by that really drive the advancement of science. Every day as we practice medicine, I think we also try to support the building of evidence in support of value for precision medicine, be that demonstrating improved clinical outcomes or be that demonstrating health economic benefits. The investment we've made there in, implementing genomics at UPMC through the UPMC Genome Center certainly falls into that category. We, I think, have the ability to capture some of the real-world evidence on the back end when we implement precision medicine approaches through the clinical data and analytics team that exists at UPMC and at Pitt. And I think we also have ways to ultimately test hypotheses in precision medicine through some of the very, very innovative clinical trial models that have been developed by our faculty and our staff here at UPMC and the University of Pittsburgh. And back to an earlier point I made, all of that we do in an organization that basically has both payer, provider, and then patient and perspectives in mind every time we look at a problem. And as a result of that, whilst it's not easy, we feel like we have a real potential opportunity to create aligned incentives between all these critical groups of stakeholders in medicine and in healthcare more broadly. So again, I want to briefly pause here, Adrian. I think that's kind of my general overview of where I think the promise of precision medicine lies in healthcare, and what are some of the barriers that we still jointly have to work through to overcome. And at this point in time, happy to take any questions of this or to advance a little bit more for the last 5 or 10 minutes to talk about specific perspectives we have as an investment team in this space.
That was great, Matthias. Can you go back to that last slide? There aren't any questions in the chat at the moment, but maybe because I do have a question for you very specifically about this, the investments that enterprises in translational science is making. Obviously, you've pointed out this, one of the premises of precision medicine is we need to understand the disease or the condition or whatever, such that we can then give the right therapy and use the right diagnostic biomarker. How much of the investment, it's kind of on this slide, how much of the investment is in fundamental science that leads to targets, for example, versus taking a target that someone already knows and then commercializes? I know you're probably interested in both, but I think we have like 30 people on the line who are probably who are interested in that. They're probably semi-entrepreneurs who are interested in this question of what would enterprises be looking for?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And thanks for giving me an opportunity to talk about that a little bit more specifically. It's not an easy question because I don't know exactly like what metric you would use, but I'll basically maybe give you a couple of different perspectives here. We fundamentally like to really balance our investment both from a perspective of supporting early stage hypothesis and idea generation, all the way basically then to, investing in more mature technology that's already on a commercial path. When you look at that from a perspective of the number of, let's call it, opportunities that we've supported in the recent past, there actually is a lot more activity in the discovery side than there is basically on the commercial side of things. We have supported through the translational science team here at UPMC Enterprises over the last 5 years, just about, I would say, 45 scientific projects in the life sciences space more broadly. Not all of them would qualify as precision medicine, but I think there are a couple in particular that stand out, including, I think, the sample in the biobank we've created with the Center of Medicine and Microbiome. I think that falls into precision medicine category. So I think there's a pretty significant number of scientific ideas that we've supported through project funding. But I think that's also not the only mechanism that we have. I think I'll come back to that on a later slide. We also have the Pittsburgh Health Data Alliance, right, which is it's a three-way collaboration between the University of Pittsburgh, UPMC, and Carnegie Mellon University, which has a slightly different focus and a slightly different twist than the translational science investment team here at UPMC Enterprises. And it basically fundamentally invests in generating, I think, computational technology, computational innovation, and then ultimately applying some of that data analytics and data manipulation capability to clinical or to scientific problems. And I think that, again, lends itself very well to driving innovation in precision medicine. And you see many of the projects that we've supported there in the recent past focus, for example, on applying data science and data analytics approaches to identifying new biomarkers, new patient stratification tools, and so on and so forth. So I think from a general perspective of the volume of work that we do, I think the majority actually is in that early discovery phase. But of course, when you then basically think about where the major dollars are being spent, I think it is probably more on the commercial side, just because the capital requirement increased so quickly when you move from idea generation to having, for example, a therapeutic target in mind to validating that target to then ultimately discovering a drug and demonstrating the value of that drug in clinical trials. I think the capital requirements just shoot through the roof, to a point where probably 2/3 of the money that we spend is on, drug discovery and development, but probably 80% of our projects are at the discovery stage.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, and that would be good. If you can carry on to the next part, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. So in the next part, I just want to close out with basically a handful of slides talking a little bit about the opportunity, but also the challenges that investors specifically, have seen in precision medicine, how they have supported, but also how they sometimes have been standing in the way of more broad-based investment in precision medicine. And I think, again, what we try to do to at least kind of bridge that gap a little bit with investment from UPMC Enterprises. So when you think about it at the broadest sense, and we look at what you see people talk about in the industry, precision medicine is really rated as one of the most impactful industry trends by investors and by executives in the life sciences and in the healthcare industry more broadly. But I think the problem with that is I think that's basically people seeing the promise. That's people getting excited about it. It doesn't necessarily correlate 100% with, where people, spend their investment dollars or where they put their investment dollars. And we'll get a little bit more into like what's the key driver of, that dichotomy where there's a lot of excitement about precision medicine, but at the same time, people are a little bit more deliberate when they think about investing their dollars. I think ultimately we've seen a lot of, progress in precision medicine that is starting to change that dynamic a little bit, which is heavily driven by the fact that I think we're moving from, I think I alluded to this earlier, testing paradigms, which are very focused on the application of precision diagnostics or precision medicine in the therapy selection space, to points in the clinical care continuum and the value creation continuum that have potentially broader applications. So I think if you think about, for example, if you're a diagnostic company that develops a companion diagnostic that's applied in prostate cancer, that's probably a reasonably sized market. There's a couple of 100,000 patients that need to be tested that way every single year. But I think since it's typically a very disease-specific biomarker, your market is somewhat limited. When you start thinking, on the other hand, about precision medicine applications like, risk assessment, disease screening, and so on and so forth, you can start to see how you would unlock a whole lot more market potential, which should get investors more excited. I think the little catch there, though, is, again, the point that we made earlier, which is evidence generation. It's not impossible, but I think if you look at some of the companies that, have supported products here on this page, and there are other products we could reference here as well, like, for example, Genomic Health, which has basically really transformed the way that we treat breast cancer with their multiplex genomic test. These are companies that make a big difference, by now have unlocked pretty significant markets for their products. But I think the path to getting there has been a path of product development for, probably the better part of 2 decades, and R&D investment spending, that basically is in the billions. And I think that's where investors are starting to ask themselves the question, at which point is the right point for me to get involved? Is it at that early discovery stage, Adrian, that you alluded to earlier? Or do I get involved at a point when the technology is more materially de-risked and maybe some of the remaining challenges are now getting broad payer support and so on and so forth? And I think that's still a challenge that investors have every single time they look at a diagnostic investment opportunity, because we still haven't, arrived at a perfect model where, compared to what we see in therapeutics, where an FDA approval more or less means you get paid for your product. In precision medicine and diagnostics in particular, you have a much, harder path. You have to do a lot more convincing. And for example, when you are lucky enough to have a product that has clinical utility, you still basically have to go almost payer by payer to convince payers to, ultimately compensate you for the risk that you've taken and for the value that you create in the healthcare system. And that's not, I think, a trivial barrier to overcome. And that has been really holding back, investment in precision medicine from an investor perspective in recent years. There's been, I think, a period of exuberance in the last year or two where ultimately on the back end of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think retail investors got very excited about life science innovation more broadly, and especially about really big idea opportunities in the diagnostic and in the screening space. But I think, unfortunately, that level of support was pretty transient. So you, for example, have seen the share prices of companies like Guardant go up, but also go down to the same degree pretty quickly within 12-month periods, as retail investors had to realize what I just described, which is the promise is huge, but the path to getting to the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow is a lot harder than people might think. So this slide basically really tries to crystallize some of that dichotomy between pharmaceuticals and devices and diagnostics. Pharmaceuticals shown on the left-hand side, devices and diagnostics shown on the left-hand side in some basic metrics. And again, it reminds you why, the promise is great, but ultimately the path to get there is so hard. So these statistics here essentially show what the success ratio is for ultimately products that start the development path in pharmaceuticals versus diagnostics and devices. And you see that's about half, the 3.5% success rate on pharmaceuticals from the start of the development process to the ultimate, product approval. And not only that, I think when you look at really how investors and how potential technology acquirers in the industry attribute value to that technology, you see that these multiples that are shown at the bottom of the graph at 12.6 for pharmaceuticals is about 50% higher than it is for devices and diagnostics. And essentially what that means is if an investor has invested 100 million in a pharmaceutical technology, you can invest probably a 50% higher return on that 100 million than you could expect when you had invested the same dollars in device or diagnostic technology. And I think that's just been a big deterrent for investors to invest in diagnostic or precision medicine type of approaches specifically in the recent past. Where that leaves me in the end, I think, is ultimately to say there's probably a unique role to play for, let's call it, atypical healthcare investors. And I think we at UPMC Enterprises try to think about ourselves as atypical healthcare investors. We still ultimately have, a financial goal that we pursue on behalf of UPMC. We're not here to basically just distribute funds in the hope of never getting them back. We try to make money for UPMC that can ultimately be reinvested in, some of the very capital intensive lines of business that we have on the provider and on the payer side. But as we do that, we don't think about value creation only in one singular dimension. So financials isn't all of it. There's also strategic value that we can create for the system. And there's ultimately also reputational value that we're trying to create for one of the most innovative healthcare systems in the country. And I think this slide here in particular is trying to just highlight where, despite the fact that we haven't made many traditional financial investments in precision medicine, we still support the idea here at UPMC and PID more broadly. I talked a lot about the Pittsburgh Health Data Alliance as like a really groundswell innovation, incubation effort in precision medicine that we've supported extensively over the years. We've talked about the UPMC Genome Center a little bit already too. I think that has received more than $25 million in cash investment from UPMC Enterprises to really stand up that state-of-the-art facility that will continue to drive innovation in precision medicine going forward. But we've also invested and collaborated very proactively with product companies in the space. We, for example, do have a portfolio company, which, if Brent was on the line, he would say it's one of my portfolio companies because it technically sits in the digital portfolio, but we've invested in a company called Infectious Disease Connect, which is using precision approaches combined with telemedicine technology to fundamentally change the way that we think about treatment selection and treatment decision-making in the space of antimicrobial infections and antimicrobial stewardship. So I think that's an area where we see great, tremendous potential for precision medicine to have an impact. And not many in the industry talk about that as a key area of innovation. People always think about oncology. People always think about autoimmune diseases, but infectious diseases are actually a big problem. In diagnostics and precision medicine, I believe, can make a big difference there to, for example, stave off the risk of antimicrobial resistance. And then we also have invested in a collaboration with a proteomics company, a high throughput proteomics company called Sumologic, where we had the opportunity to invest. We saw the ultimate financial case as a little bit too risky, but at the same time, liked the technology enough to basically help this company, which ultimately comes from a life science tools background, drive the transition of their multiplex proteomic technology into the clinical realm. And we're currently preparing for the potential launch of a couple of clinical trials with that team to really demonstrate how multiplexed proteomic signatures can drive therapy selections, especially in patients with diabetes and cardiovascular risk factors. So again, investing in precision medicine isn't easy, but I think if you do it in the right way, you can fundamentally support the continued evolution of this important theme and the science that basically underpins it, and ultimately can create, I think, value immediately through purely, I think, the impact that some of these technologies, even as we're developing them, even as they are pre-commercial, can offer to patients at UPMC and the University of Pittsburgh as we get involved in that technology development and some of these pilot studies. So I want to do a quick time check here because I think this is pretty much, with the exception of maybe one slide, all that I have, but I think I've tried to get my key points across, and at this point would be happy to take a few more questions.
Yeah, that was perfect, Matthias. That was a great summary of enterprises. And then I think it was nice how you highlighted the opportunities and the challenges in investments in precision medicine. There are no questions in the chat, but maybe I can ask one, because I see a lot of people online who are in the diagnostic space. And that exit slide you showed on diagnostics versus therapeutics was a bit sobering for the people who work on diagnostics, I bet. And so the question is, I think if I'm right, the enterprises investments like portfolio companies and stuff like that is heavily towards therapeutics. And if that's true, would you look for the people who are in the diagnostic space, are you looking for less risky investments, i.e. they need to be further along in their de-risking and their suitability and their evidence base, particularly in the diagnostic space, to invest in that? Do you think people get worried about that investment in that space?
I think your question is a good one, and it's in some ways actually a segue. I should show my last slide. So I did have a slide here to basically say, well, what are we excited about from a perspective of the diagnostic and precision medicine investments or investment areas? I don't think you can blanket say that there's more interest for us to invest in later stage technology versus early technology. I think ultimately, for us, it becomes a question of pinpointing the solution to a very, very clear clinical problem, where I think many in the industry try to dream the upside and invest in, for example, things like early detection in cancer, which is a great goal. And we know if ever it will basically come to fruition, it will probably have a significant impact. But we could have a whole seminar around why early detection in cancer is challenging, because, from a clinical actionability perspective, not even from a, health economic benefit perspective, that problem hasn't been solved yet. So basically making an early possible diagnosis using a blood-based test in oncology is only so helpful at this point in time. Any clinician would tell you this. But I think there are more concrete applications, for example, for next generation liquid biopsy approaches that focus, for example, more on therapy selection in more discrete patient populations with much more actionable results that we would be very excited about. And, we've looked at a number of companies in that space, for example, recently. We haven't made an investment, but that was not because we don't like the space. Some of these companies just don't have the right management team or don't have, the right level of validation yet to make it viable. But it's certainly something we're excited about. Another area that we're excited about, and again, it's not a question of maturity, but it's really a question of having the right type of solution, is this antimicrobial diagnostic solution space. I talked a little bit about ID Connect, which, again, it's more of a back-end focused solution when you have the right information at your disposal. But I think there's a lot of room for diagnostic innovation to basically shorten the time period between a patient being diagnosed with a hard-to-manage infectious disease and knowing exactly what that infection is comprised of, what species are present there, and how you would ultimately best deploy some of the limited options of highly impactful antimicrobial drugs without the risk of ultimately having to switch or creating greater pressure on the microbes to generate resistant clones. So I think that's an area that we've actively looked at from an investment perspective. And if anyone's innovative in that area, I think we'd love to talk to them. And I think the other area that we really like is population genomics. I think this again becomes ultimately probably a little bit more of a, let's call it data management and workflow question, not so much a basic technology question, because extracting value from population genomics approaches really then hinges on new business models that allow you to disseminate that data in an efficient way, make it accessible to the clinician in a way that, irrespective of your own level of, precision medicine or genomic literacy, you can do something within that information. And most importantly, making that information available to the provider at any given point in time, right? Without creating silos, without basically putting that data in a place where it's valuable at decision point A, but not at decision point B, because ultimately investing in population genomics, I think, requires finding ways to extract lifelong value from those genetic sequences. And I think any sort of technology that's emerging in that space would be one that be very excited to look at. So I think these, in response to your question, are probably just three areas where I would say we would be tremendously supportive of new innovations that are focused on addressing these problems. And there's probably more, but I think those were just three ones that I wanted to highlight.
Yeah, and I would say that wasn't a softball question to you. I didn't know you had that slide coming up.
No, it was a nice coincidence.
So there is a question from Xinghua Liu, and I think this is, you've talked about this to the barriers. You're pretty open about the barriers, and I think this is a question from him, which I think relates to that. He's developing AI models for precision medicine or artificial intelligence models, I should say, for precision medicine. And this is his question, while the preliminary results are exciting, we realize the resistance, as you mentioned, particularly creating evidence supporting adoption by clinician and payers. What would you recommend for early developers to overcome such challenges, to kind of get to that point where they have this evidence that there's an excitement to then invest in it? How do the early people get there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we know Xinghua and we know his work, and I think we've been supportive in that respect already, because I think it all starts with generating a strong hypothesis. And I think that's where we can clearly be very helpful, right? I think having these, retrospective data set that a group like Xinghua's can basically apply their algorithms to and basically pull out signatures that might have predictive value, I think is something that still requires investment, but I think it's that small scale investment that you can make early on. I think ultimately that's the type of technology that really then suffers from this real challenge in moving it into the prospective validation stage, where you ultimately have to apply those algorithms and apply those decision-making criteria in large-scale clinical trials in new patients to kind of demonstrate that, the stratification that you're driving really ultimately changes the course of care. That probably requires, pairing up with well-capitalized partners. I think they are out there. And to the degree that's helpful, I think we have good connectivity with players in the industry. I mean, SomaLogic on the proteomics side is just one example, but if there are others, if a technology has matured to a point where at least that retrospective validation has been done, and I think that data is compelling, it really becomes a question of finding a home that can make those hundreds and hundreds of millions of investments into prospective clinical trials that are required. In the absence of any sort of change, and I think the regulatory and the payer expectations around evidence, I don't think there's another good viable path. But I think that's also a conversation maybe for another time. You really sometimes have to ask yourself, when you apply those type of signatures, are you really exposing patients to drug-like risks? Or should the FDA be thinking about much more streamlined pathways to get a technology to the point of being able to prove itself in the clinic? Right? Because at the moment, you have to get a point where a payer pays for you and they want to see large-scale clinical trials, and those are prohibitively expensive. If you really had a more thematic assessment of risk for some of these diagnostic solutions, and in many instances, you probably won't hurt anyone, by providing diagnostic information to an educated provider, maybe we could run a whole lot more real-world evidence generation at a much lower cost and drive more diagnostic solutions to a point where ultimately the evidence is there to support reimbursement.
Yeah, I think one of the points you made, Matthias, which is important, is that you have a network of people you interact with. Obviously, you go, I know this because I work with you, but you review tons of companies. You have a network of venture capital groups and other companies. And so I think if people need that help, it's not just enterprises that can invest in stuff. There are others. Obviously, you can put in contact with other supporters, and maybe there are other homes where it might sit better. Yeah,
that's another great point. I think ultimately, the more people you find that will ultimately be willing to share the risk of continually investing in these like high risk technologies, the easier it becomes. And I think to your point, yes, we have contacts on the investor side, some of which are skeptics and some of which are actually very bullish on precision medicine type of approaches that could always be helpful in terms of, continuing to focus a story on the most impactful, or focus a company on the most impactful solutions, and ultimately getting to a point where, investment can be attracted for that technology.
Well, Matthias, we've come up to the hour. We've just gone past the hour. So I want to thank you again for doing this. I think it was very informative. I hope the people on the line learned a lot from it. I hope it will set off some more dialogue and some more interactions, and this will, promote precision medicine.
Yeah, that's great. And again, thank you for the opportunity to share our thoughts here a little bit. I know it's a complex area, but if people have ideas in terms of like how to drive towards new technologies and how to address some of the challenges that we were able to kind of pinpoint here today, we're always happy to talk. People probably know where to find us, and if not, Adrian can show you the way.
Okay, thank you, Matthias. Really appreciate it.
Yep, thank you.
Bye-bye.